The Rockford Asylum, a closed institution on the outskirts of the city, had long been notorious. The former psychiatric asylum, which once treated patients with severe disorders, now stood abandoned and ruined. For decades, locals had avoided the place, telling stories of strange noises, shadows in the windows, and people who changed after stepping through the doors. A young journalist named Jordan Miller, full of ambition and determination, decided to see for himself what was going on there. His goal was clear: to gather material that would impress his editor and open the door to the big world of journalism. He had heard many stories, but he didn't believe them. All of them, in his opinion, were exaggerations created to add mystique to a forgotten place. The sun was already hiding behind the horizon when Jordan parked near the gate. The orphanage building under the tall trees resembled a giant stone monument immersed in shadow. The metal gate stood open, as if inviting him in. The wind ran through the overgrown weeds, creating sounds that resembled whispers. He brought a flashlight, camera, and notebook. After checking his equipment, he took the first step out the gate. The creak with which they closed behind him echoed in the evening silence. The shelter greeted him with the smell of damp and stale air. Old doors and broken windows opened onto dark corridors where every shadow looked as if it might come to life. Jordan stopped to take a few pictures, capturing the dilapidated walls and old furniture covered in dust and mold. For the first few minutes, everything seemed quite normal, except for the oppressive silence. But gradually something began to change. The air became heavy, almost sticky, like before a thunderstorm. It seemed as if the building was breathing, releasing old smells and sounds. Jordan heard a slight creaking sound, like footsteps, coming from somewhere on the second floor. Probably the wind, he thought, though he wasn't sure. His goal was clear: to find the archive room, where there might be records of former patients and doctors. His curiosity was piqued by stories about Dr. Graves, the former head of the institution, whose treatments were allegedly too innovative. The corridors seemed endless. Some rooms still had beds covered with a thick layer of dust. There were remnants of old posters with medical instructions on the walls, but most of them were so worn off that it was impossible to make out the text. Jordan approached a door labeled Archive. The lock looked old and rusty, but it gave way easily as soon as he pushed the handle. Inside the room was dark, the smell of dust mixed with moisture. He turned on the flashlight, illuminating the rows of old cabinets and drawers. On the table, he found a tattered journal labeled Patient Report, 1953. It contained records about the condition of patients, but many pages were torn out or covered with an unknown liquid. Jordan began to photograph the records when he heard a sound, a whisper. It was not the wind. The whisper was clear and seemed to be coming from the depths of the corridor. Jordan froze, listening. His heart began to pound loudly in his chest. He peered carefully into the darkness outside the archive door, but saw nothing. And then, in the light of the lantern, he noticed a handprint left on the dust next to him. The print was not old. Jordan froze, feeling a chill run down his spine. The handprint was all too clear, as if it had been left only seconds ago. He leaned in closer, shining his flashlight on it, and noticed that the footprint seemed wet, glistening in the light. A thought flashed through his mind. Someone is here. He began to quickly take pictures of the magazines and records, but every movement was echoed in the silence that seemed to swallow everything around him. A barely audible whisper came again from the corridor. This time it was closer, and Jordan could clearly make out the individual words. The voice was quiet, but it was like a multitude of voices, and it sounded like it was coming from different parts of the room at the same time. "Don't stay here. Go." Jordan stepped back, hitting an old chair. He froze, waiting to see what would happen next, but everything was quiet. It could be one of the teenagers playing a prank, he thought, though deep down he knew it was something else. He heard the footsteps again, This time they sounded clearer and closer. The corridor outside the archive door was dark, and the flashlight didn't reach all the way down. It seemed as if something was hiding in the depths of the shadows, watching his every move. Jordan made a decision: leave the archive and find a way out. He slipped out into the corridor, carefully closing the door. However, when he looked back, the corridor he had come down now seemed different. The ceiling was lower, the walls narrower, and the air even thicker. "Don't panic," he whispered to himself, clutching the camera. Strange spots appeared on the walls that looked like hand and fingernail prints. They stretched along the corridor, forming incomprehensible patterns. The further he walked, the more it seemed to him that these spots were moving as if they were alive. At the end of the corridor, he saw a door. Above it hung a sign with the inscription, "Therapy Room." Jordan hesitated. His heart told him to run away, but something about the door drew him in. He reached out and opened it. The room inside was unexpectedly clean. The furniture was worn, but not as damaged as in the previous rooms. In the center was a table, and on it was a neatly folded magazine. The light of its lantern showed the title, "Special Cases. Dr. Graves, ****. Jordan slowly picked up the magazine, feeling his fingers go numb from the cold. He began to read. Subjects are showing unusual reactions to therapy. The mental state of many is deteriorating, which I see as progress. We are approaching a discovery. Influence on reality, going beyond normal perception. The more he read, the more he realized that this doctor was trying to change the minds of his patients, to make them see something that did not exist. But some of them, according to the text, did not return. Suddenly, he heard a sound from behind him, like a long, squeaky exhalation. Jordan turned around. The light of the lantern fell on a figure in the corner of the room. It was something tall and thin, its outline blurred as if it were made of smoke. It moved slowly toward him. Jordan dropped the magazine and ran for the door, but it slammed shut in his face. He pushed it open, but to no avail. The approaching entity seemed to tremble, changing shape. The whispers that had been coming from a distance now enveloped him from all sides. His camera, hanging around his neck, suddenly turned on, and a bright flash momentarily illuminated the room. He noticed dozens of shadows emerging from the walls like distorted human silhouettes. With an effort, the door finally gave way, and Jordan ran out into the hallway. Behind him, he heard a sound, not footsteps, but something that sounded like crawling, like wet cloths dragging across the floor. "Out of here! Quick!" came a voice that sounded like a man. Jordan saw a young man in the doorway waving at him. Without thinking, he ran toward him. Jordan ran into the doorway, and the stranger immediately closed the door behind him, breathing heavily. Pieces of decayed wood lay on the floor, and the walls were covered with stains that looked like dried cracks that pulsed in the lantern light. He looked over at the rescuer, a young man in tattered clothes, with traces of dust and dirt on his jacket. The man gestured to Jordan to be quiet. "What was that?" the journalist whispered. The stranger only nodded at the door, listening to the sounds in the corridor. There was still a strange sound like wet crawling. The room they found themselves in was small. There was a couch in the corner with torn straps on it, similar to those used to restrain patients. On the floor were fragments of an old mirror, and a black film covered the window as if there were nothing behind it. "You're not alone here?" asked Jordan, looking at the stranger. The man nodded slowly, keeping his hand on the doorknob as if he was afraid of being kicked in. He seemed to know the building better than Jordan. His movements were cautious but confident. "The place is changing," the stranger finally whispered without looking at him. "The longer you stay here, the harder it is to find a way out." Jordan didn't say anything, but his heart was beating so loudly that he was afraid the creatures lurking in the corridors might hear it. After a few minutes, everything quieted down. The stranger finally let go of the door and gestured to another exit in the corner of the room. "This leads deeper," he grunted, bending down to the floor and looking at the tracks that stretched across the concrete. They looked like snake tracks, but with faint fingerprints. Jordan felt the tension rising. Something in this place was acting on his mind. The stains on the walls began to slowly change. They looked like distorted faces frozen in a silent scream. His camera suddenly turned on and made a random flash, illuminating the room. For a moment, he saw them, silhouettes frozen in the corners, seemingly merging with the walls. The shadows moved and approached as soon as the flash went out. "Let's go!" The stranger's short order brought Jordan out of his daze. They began to move further down the corridor that seemed endless. The ceiling slowly dropped, and the walls shrank, forcing them to lean lower and lower. Each step echoed, sounding differently than it should. "This place is consumed by fear," the stranger said quietly, though his voice seemed muffled. Jordan could feel the air become thick, like a viscous liquid pressing against his chest. The corridor seemed to be dragging them deeper, each step harder and the sounds closer. They came out into a larger room that looked like a conference room. In the center was a table covered with a thick layer of dust. On it were old documents and medical-like instruments, some rusty, others warped, as if they had been altered on purpose. On the wall hung a portrait of a doctor in a white coat, with a stern face and a penetrating gaze. Below was a sign, "Dr. Graves." "He's the one who started it," the stranger said quietly, pointing to the portrait. Jordan came closer, looking at the portrait. Everything seemed normal until he noticed that the eyes in the portrait seemed to follow his movements. Behind him, he heard the same sound, slippery, creeping, approaching at a rapid pace. "Hide," the stranger whispered. They both hid behind the overturned furniture, keeping the lights off. Something that resembled a shadow crept out of the room's entrance, but it was thicker and trembled like a liquid. It stopped, as if sniffing them, and then slowly moved toward the table. Jordan held his breath, hoping the creature wouldn't notice them. Jordan and the stranger froze, unmoving, watching the shadowy creature slither across the room. It circled the table, as if studying the objects on it, then dissolved into darkness, leaving behind only a light hissing sound that gradually faded. When it was quiet, the stranger touched Jordan's shoulder, gesturing to another exit. They carefully left the room, leaving the shadowy stalker behind. The corridor they continued down seemed even more distorted. The walls seemed to change shape. The air shivered like a hot fog. "This place feels alive," Jordan thought, feeling his body grow heavier. He noticed that every step seemed to be viscous. His feet were hard to lift off the floor. At the end of the corridor, they came across a new door. It had a sign on it, "Treatment Area. Staff only, ****. The stranger pushed the door open, and it swung open without a sound, revealing a gloomy room. Inside were chairs bolted to the floor, and in the center was a metal couch with straps. The ceiling was low, almost overwhelming. The shelves were lined with instruments that looked like medical ones, but most of them were strangely shaped, bent, stretched, as if they had become part of this eerie building. Jordan noticed remnants of old fabrics on the couch that looked like someone had left them decades ago. There were sketches on the walls that resembled distorted faces, like fingernail marks. "Dr. Graves worked here," the stranger whispered as he looked around the room. His voice sounded muffled, as if the room had absorbed the sound. Jordan walked over to the couch. He noticed that the date was engraved on the metal, 1953. Next to it was a barely legible inscription, "All for Science." On the floor was a journal similar to the ones he had seen in the archive. He picked it up, carefully flipping through the pages. Patients show intense reactions to therapy. The psychological state of many goes beyond the limits of ordinary understanding. Their consciousness does not return. They remain between two worlds. Jordan felt his throat go dry. He no longer doubted that this building had become a prison for the souls of those who had been treated here. Suddenly a sound came from the corridor again. It was not an ordinary hiss, but something deeper, like heavy breathing, which was slowly approaching. The stranger grabbed Jordan's arm and pointed to a door on the other side of the room. "We have to go," he said shortly. They walked out into a long hallway, where the distorted stains on the walls appeared again. Finger and nail prints now stretched across the ceiling, forming a strange pattern. The air became thicker, and it was harder to breathe. On the floor, they noticed old footprints leading to another door, but this door seemed newer than everything else. Above it was a sign, "Purification." "What does that mean?" Jordan looked at the stranger, but he just shook his head. Opening the door, they found themselves in a room filled with thick fog. It mixed with the light of the lantern, forming ghostly outlines in the air. In the center was a large metal container that looked like a water tank. Large mirrors hung on the walls, but their surfaces were so cloudy that they reflected only fuzzy outlines. "This is a ritual room," the stranger muttered, his voice trembling. Jordan moved closer to the tank and saw that there was a thick, dark liquid inside. It trembled as if reacting to his presence. Whispers began to come out of the fog again. At first it was indistinct, but later it became clearer. Asterisk, "You will stay here too." Suddenly, one of the figures in the mirror began to move. Jordan jumped back, and the stranger screamed, pointing to the liquids in the tank. They began to rise, forming what looked like a shadowy creature. The shadow from the tank stretched toward them, its shape constantly changing. Arms or tentacles reached out to them, creating strange, bizarre patterns in the air. "This thing is locking us in here," Jordan exclaimed, grabbing the stranger's hand. They tried to escape through the door, but it slammed shut behind them. The mirrors began to vibrate, creating broken, distorted images of their faces. The shadows in the mirrors moved closer and closer, as if they were being released. The shadowy entity burst out of the tank, its shape changing with each passing moment, breaking up and reassembling into something terribly incomprehensible. It seemed to live outside of logic, and its every movement made the air around it tremble. The whispering from the mirrors grew louder, filling the room with incomprehensible words that drove fear into their minds. Jordan and the stranger rushed to the opposite corner of the room, where an old door was visible in the wall, partially hidden by a broken shelf. They pushed the furniture aside with all their might until the shadow from the tank reached out to them, almost hitting Jordan on the shoulder. Opening the door, they found themselves in a dark corridor, narrow and low, leading into the unknown. Jordan held the flashlight ahead of him, but the light seemed to be absorbed by the walls before reaching the end. There was a hissing sound behind them, and they could hear something moving behind them, scraping the walls. The corridor led down to a room that looked like a warehouse. In the center was a large metal device with buttons and levers. It had a sign on it: Energy Control, Emergency Activation, ****. The stranger immediately rushed to it, studying the levers. "This could be the way out," he said. Jordan looked around the room. There were sheets of paper on the floor that looked like instructions. One of them was signed with Dr. Gray's name. **Experimental Energy Device. Used to stabilize space and prevent the loss of objects." "This device. It's holding them here," Jordan muttered, pointing to the inscription. A sharp click came from the room they had come in. The shadow that had been following them now filled the corridor, its shape changing to fill the space. The ceiling and walls seemed to stretch to give it room. "Pull the lever," Jordan shouted. The stranger pressed the red button, then pulled the lever sharply. The device started working, emitting a deep hum that gradually turned into a strong, vibrating sound. A light appeared in the air, gradually becoming brighter, bursting out of every corner of the room. The shadow froze, Its shape began to dissipate like smoke, melting into a bright glow. The corridor was also changing. The walls, which had been curved before, began to return to their normal state. Jordan and the stranger stood in the middle of the room, watching the light completely fill the room. Then the device went silent, and everything around them froze. The corridors now looked empty and abandoned, with no distorted shadows or whispers. The air became lighter, and the fear that had been pressing down on their chests disappeared. "Is this it?" Jordan whispered, not believing they were finally safe. The stranger nodded. That was close. They walked out into the courtyard of the orphanage, where it was already dawn. The building looked old now, but not as terrifying as it had a few hours ago. Jordan looked around, but saw no movement or signs of the entities. When they parted ways, Jordan looked at his camera, which he thought had been turned off during all the events. However, it was still on. He looked through the pictures and videos he had recorded and saw that one of the shots he had taken in the tank room was of a figure that looked like Dr. Graves. Her face looked too clear, and her eyes were looking directly at him. Jordan left the city, but it seems the asylum building did not leave him. His camera was found a week later on the side of the road, but Jordan himself was never seen again.